Right, first, I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. This is AsiaEdit's first webinar. And we're going to be looking on how to ensure that your paper makes an impact. And I'm delighted to introduce our co-chief editor, Dr. Rachel Barron. She's now been working with AsiaEdit for over 10 years. I can't say more than that for privacy reasons. As everyone knows, a lady's age is her secret. And during this period, has helped hundreds of university professors achieve publication success. Rachel has a PhD in psychology from the University of Exeter in the UK. And aside from overseeing the training of many of our editing team, she currently teaches at an English-speaking university in Italy. So welcome, Rachel. Thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks for the introduction. And hello to everybody. Thanks for joining us today. So as Nick said, in this webinar, we're going to look at the various things you can do before you submit your paper to your target journal to make sure that it makes the best impact possible. So in other words, to make sure everything is as good as it possibly can be. As editors, a lot of the things that we change may seem trivial, but they all add up to create a really good impression when you submit to your chosen journal. Journal editors and reviewers will not be impressed if you send them what seems like a draft. So even if you don't use our editing service, it's a good idea to perform the same kind of checks that we do. However, the first thing we need to do is to make sure you're submitting to the right journal. So we're going to start with this, as some of the checks you need to do will depend on the target journal and its submission requirements. And then we'll look at how to write a good cover letter.
Okay. I mean, there are tens of thousands of academic journals out there, Rachel. How can authors narrow down their search for the right one or the most appropriate one? Right,
yes. It can seem like a difficult task, and a lot of authors just choose the journal that they're most familiar with. So obviously people are familiar with journals, particularly in their field, and that obviously makes sense to consider the ones that you're most familiar with. But there are a number of other factors that it's really important to take into account when you're deciding which one is the most appropriate. So what do we do when we're selecting a journal? First of all, the first task is to check the journal's mission statement, aims, and scope. So this basically gives you an idea of the kind of papers that the journal will accept. And obviously journals won't accept papers that don't match their criteria, so they don't match their aims and scope. So it's really important that you make sure this is your first step. You also need to consider whether the journal reaches your target audience, especially if your research is cross-disciplinary. So, for instance, if your paper was reporting the development of a new measurement scale for assessing clinical outcomes, would it be better to target readers who are interested in using the scale in clinical practice, or should the main focus be on the methodology of the scale development? And that kind of decision will make a big difference to the kind of journal that you're looking at. So also check that the journal accepts the type of paper you're submitting, because obviously not all papers are original research. You might be submitting a case study or a review or some other kind of paper. Just make sure that the journal actually accepts that kind of paper, because not all of them do. Then I would advise looking at some recently published papers, just to have a check what kind of things have recently been published, to get an idea of their tone, the kind of style that they're using, and make sure that your paper fits in comfortably with these recently published papers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I mean, should authors then always aim for the highest impact journal that they can?
Yes, although I was just going to look at this example here first of,
okay.
This is just an example of some journal instructions from a journal called Mindfulness. And it shows you the aims and scope, which is to mindfulness seeks to advance research, clinical practice, and theory on mindfulness. And then it goes into more detail about the kind of things that they are interested in, encourages submissions on various different aspects of mindfulness, and then gives you some examples of topics. So this is the kind of thing that you'll be looking at when you start searching journals, and you'll be looking at this kind of statement first. Okay, so back to the impact factor. Is it the most important? Yes, it is. It's very important to submit to as high an impact journal as you can, but you have to be realistic. So although everyone aims to get into the top tier journals, you should really only aim for as high as you think is realistic for the impact of your particular paper. So for instance, if your research is only of local interest and doesn't report important novel findings, it's unlikely that it's going to be reviewed by a top international journal that publishes groundbreaking research. In other words, match the potential impact of your paper to the impact of the journal. Another point to think about is the turnaround time. So journals often give an idea of how long it will take to send your paper out for review and get back to you, but also how long it takes from acceptance of a paper to eventual publication. And these times can be really quite lengthy. So you might just want to bear in mind, if you think your paper should be published urgently, if it's on a very current hot topic such as COVID, you might want to take the turnaround time into account and maybe choose one that can review your paper the fastest. Another thing to check is the word limit for the type of paper. So if you have already written your paper and it's come out at 6,000 words, 8,000 words or whatever, and then you're looking at a target journal that has a limit of 4,000 words, then you really have to think seriously about whether it's feasible to cut down your paper to the word limit, or whether it's just going to be easier to find a different journal. It's not easy. We try to do it in editing sometimes. We try to cut.
Yeah, we do. We get requests, don't we? We do have requests. Can you reduce this 9,000 word document to 4,000? And it's yes.
We can even manage a few. Yeah, we can manage a few hundred words, but yeah, cutting a paper virtually in half is really important, even for the author, let alone for us. Yeah. Indeed.
Okay. How about open access journals? I mean, are they worth looking at all?
Yes, I think so. I think they're really becoming increasingly common, and a lot of journals are offering this option now. That the advantage that they give is that they open up the research to a much wider audience, because it doesn't have to be, it's not behind a paywall, so anybody can access it, which I think is probably where we'd all like our research to be. We're like, if we're doing something important, we're doing important research work, then reaching as wide an audience as possible with it is presumably your main goal. So yeah, open access is definitely a way to do this. Not all journals offer the option, but almost all of them do these days. Some of them are completely open access, so they're definitely worth a look at. The one downside of them is that they do have to charge for their services. So whereas with normal journal publications, the end reader pays for the publication, with open access journals, it's actually the author who pays. But many authors just incorporate this into their grant applications so that they make sure that the cost of publication is already covered.
Right, I see. Now I hear there are some tools that you can use to help you search for journals. Do you have any examples of any of these tools?
Yes, indeed. Yes, they can be really useful. I've just picked one as an example, but if you search for journal selection tool online, you will, I'm sure, find more examples. I think I need to just switch my screen sharing. Yes. No, it's not doing it. Excuse me. It's not sharing now, is it, Nick?
It's not sharing now.
No. Oh dear. This is the problem that we were trying to overcome earlier.
Right. Okay, but I mean, if you were to do so you can search for journal search tool, and it'll take you to a website where you can go through various metrics to limit, to focus on the journal that would be appropriate for your paper.
That's
right?
correct. So so what you do is you basically type in either just the name of your paper, or you can type in some keywords as well, or you can type in the entire abstract in some of them too. So this will bring up a kind of list of potential journals based on those kind of keywords, and it will give you the metrics for them. So they differ in the amount of information that they provide, but they might, for instance, provide information on the impact factor. It's probably the one thing you want to look at first. They also often give like the kind of the aims and scope that similar to the ones I just showed you, so that you can get an overview. So you don't have to go to each journal individually. You can just use these journal search tools to go through one after another. So it kind of really speeds up the process.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and some of them helpfully include the turnaround times as well, but that's not always available.
What we'll do at the end of this today, we'll share this PowerPoint with the attendees, and when you have that PDF, that link will take you to the website that you'd like us to see, right? So everyone here will be able to see that afterwards, even though we can't show it to you right now. Yes,
I'm sorry about that. I don't know why it's...
Well, that's technology. We're all that's how things work. Now, you showed us earlier on, I mean, with the journal there, that it gave you the topics that the journal's interested in covering. So it gave some limitations, which is really good. So it helps you decide which journal to go for. I mean, having chosen that journal, you see some journals have a lot of very detailed instructions for authors to follow. I mean, is it really important that an author follows all those instructions? They're very detailed. Or can they just submit a document and expect the journal to do that for them?
Unfortunately, no. It's true that some journals' instructions can be really lengthy, and they just look daunting at first. There can be an endless list of things that you need to be considering as you prepare your paper. Some of them, if you think ahead and actually select your target journal before you start writing your paper, then of course you have a big advantage, because you can do all the formatting required by the journal as you go along. So for instance, some of them ask you to use a journal template so that everybody submits using the same word template, and that kind of simplifies the process. But obviously, if you only find that out once you've written your paper, then it can cause obviously a lot of extra time reformatting. So some journals are very easy. I was going to show you some examples of guidelines. The Springer submission guidelines are really quite comprehensive. You'll be able to access them through the link here. So they will cover everything from formatting to the kind of the language that you need to use, whether a UK or US English. Often they even give advice on the kind of punctuation and using italics, emphasis, all kinds of little details, many of which we're going to look at in a minute. So yeah, it's really important that you follow them as closely as possible, because journals may not accept them for review unless your paper complies with their guidelines. The only good thing is that some journals, I think, are becoming quite enlightened in allowing you to submit your paper in any format you choose at the first submission. And this link here is to Elsevier, which now offers this option. That means you can submit without having to change anything at all. Just send it in the format it's in. And if it gets through the first review process, then you'll make the changes necessary to comply with the journal's guidelines at the second stage. So that can be really time saving if you think that you're going to possibly need to send it to more than one journal before it gets accepted. Right.
Okay. And was there's another link there as well, I think, of...
Yeah, oh, sorry, yes, there is. Yes, sorry, I should have mentioned there's this was another example of some journal instructions that appear on a separate PDF style sheets. So you go to the journal page, and rather than getting the actual instructions, you have to download a PDF. Now, when we are editing, we often we have to follow these links, obviously, and sometimes it can be quite frustrating because there can be several links to follow. It's not necessarily straightforward in just finding one PDF. There might be different instructions for the journal itself, but also for the publisher. So it'll go maybe say follow the instructions for Springer overall, but that includes hundreds of journals, and then it'll have very specific instructions for the specific journal you're looking at. So do make sure that you follow all of these different links and download all the PDFs that you can see.
Right. I mean, I guess the best tip there is then to have a look at some of the already published articles in that journal, so you get a good sense of what the style and the layout and the formatting is, right? Yeah. Yes,
that's a good idea. But yeah, like also kind of use it as like a checklist. I would say that kind of make sure you don't miss anything. As I say, we're going to go through some of these things in a moment, and it'll just highlight the kind of issues that they're looking for in their guidelines.
Okay. And references. I mean, you mentioned them just now as part of the formatting. I mean, do authors need to change the style for different journals, or is there just a? I mean, you had there your paper your way. Does that apply for references?
So if it's an example of your paper your way, then no, they will allow you to submit the references in any format. But unfortunately for other journals, you are going to probably have to reformat your references. There are numerous different ways of presenting a reference list. We kind of get used to the styles in our own field. So I, as a psychologist, was taught to follow APA style from when I very first started studying as an undergraduate. So that is most familiar to me. And it wasn't for many years that I really grasped that there were very many different styles. So rather than taking it for granted that the style that you're most familiar with is the one that the journal uses, you do need to check. If you use referencing software, it can save you an awful lot of time, because you can just ask it to output the references in a different style. It doesn't always do it perfectly, but it's definitely a time-saving step. So it's well worth looking at using that kind of software. I've covered most of these points. Don't forget about checking the in-text citations as well, because obviously the style of those changes along with the reference style. So again, there's no one style that you need to follow. Just make sure that you're using a consistent style, even if the journal doesn't specify one. Look at the style that's being used in published papers and follow the style that they're using there.
Okay, so you've chosen the journal. You're following the guidelines. You're making sure that you're checking off against the instructions. What else does an author need to take into consideration at this stage?
Okay, so I think the next thing to do is to really thoroughly check your paper. I think it's true for everyone that no matter how many times you read through your paper, you won't notice at least some of the aspects of presentation and consistency that we're going to look at in a moment. Of course, as an author, you're completely focused on the content of the paper, and up to this point, that's absolutely correct. But there is a point where you really do need to look at the presentation and make sure that it shows care and attention to detail. A messily presented paper could imply a similar lack of attention to detail in the actual research. So you really don't want to give that impression to the journal editor or the reviewers. Editors and reviewers also really appreciate it if you go into this, if you really focus on the detail, because it means they can probably properly focus on the content of the research rather than being distracted by all sorts of inconsistencies and puzzling things that they don't understand. So you could use the following things that I'm going to mention as a checklist, but we'll just run through some of the most important ones first. So we often, when we are editing, get papers where we see the title page, and obviously it's not always the finished title page, but we ask authors to include a basic amount of information that is required by all journals. So this is an example taken from APA requirements of the title page and all the information that needs to be included. It should include, at a minimum, the title of the paper, the author names and the affiliations and the contact information of the corresponding author. This example also includes a statement that there are no known conflicts to declare, and that's something that is required by APA. And there's also these author notes with their ORCID IDs. A running head may be needed as well. So the running head goes up here in the header. I'm pretty sure that most journals will want one, but if you don't include one, sometimes they will write one themselves. So it's better to write one that you actually have chosen. The page numbers also go in the often go in the header up here, top right, in the case of APA, but other journal guidelines might ask you to include them at the bottom of the page or wherever. And then there are other declarations that you might need to include in other specific sections. So these sections might include disclosures such as the one we just saw on the title page, and then acknowledgements and funding declarations and other things like that they often want to, or maybe ethics. So make sure that all these are included in the correct place. So maybe on the title page, but maybe in separate sections somewhere else in the paper, often after the references. Mm-hmm. Okay. So next, check your overall paper formatting, such as your page margins and whether you need to use columns or it's very rare to use columns actually in social sciences editing, but it's not, it depends which kind of field you're in, the kind of target journal that you're looking at. So do check just in case you need to use columns. 1-inch columns are pretty much the most common. I don't ever see any guidelines that recommend smaller margins than 1 inch, and some of them are larger. I have also already mentioned the running head. So the APA style, for instance, requires a running head of up to 50 characters. And then also look at the line spacing and font. So some journals give a page limit rather than a word limit, and it can be really tempting to reduce your font size and spacing and cram in as much text as possible. Obviously, this is great if you are really got a really dense paper, but it can be it can be horrendous for the reader. So as you can see from these examples, a 12-point double space type is far easier to read than 9-point single space type. So with a 9-point, you're squeezing more text, but consider how likely it is that it'll actually be read. We really notice these things when we're editing, because we read papers all day long, and it can be really frustrating. It's so tiring to read the text like this and crammed together with no space. And I'm sure that reviewers and journal editors feel the same. So do anything you can to avoid creating a negative impression, really.
I guess, I mean, it's more likely that people go for the small text and missing spaces when there's a page limitation as opposed to a word limitation, right? So yes, we've all seen people try and cheat this way.
Yeah. Exactly, and I think that's probably why most journals do give a word limit rather than a page limit, but we certainly do still see them with page limits. But yeah, as I say, be sensible about it, because I say creating any kind of negative impression is just not good. Okay, so next we have heading style. Some journals will ask you to follow a particular heading style, but if they don't, then you just need to make sure that your headings are all consistent at each level. So what we look for is things like consistency in the use of bold and italic text, capitalization and indentation of the heading style. And then we have paragraph indentation. So it's common to indent every single paragraph. Just the first line of each paragraph, of course. Some styles say indent every paragraph, but not the one immediately following a heading. And some styles don't want you to indent anything. If there's no advice, then it doesn't matter which way you go, but again, just make sure it's consistent so it looks nice and tidy. Also check, we just mentioned word limits, but check whether there are any word limits for different sections, because this can be really frustrating. So you've selected your journal and found that you've got 5,000 words, only to find that that's divided in a way that doesn't really work for your particular paper. So yeah, it's obviously abstracts often have quite strict word length, but it's also quite common to see introductions and discussions with word length as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. The abstract, I mean, that's often got quite a strict word limit, hasn't it?
Yes, the reason for that is because of the software that the database software that it goes into that can only cope with abstracts of a certain length. So it's not really even the journals that enforce that rule. It's the databases that they use, and so they have to be within a. Next, think about the tables and figures, whether they need to be embedded in the paper or whether they should be at the end of the paper or included in a separate file. Again, not all journals will specify which method to use, but do check, because many of them will want them in a particular style. And many journals have detailed guidelines on the presentation of the figures and tables themselves. They even have kind of limits on the or minimum resolutions and so on for figures. So just check that everything that you need to about the tables and figures that you're going to include. Next, oh yes, sorry, one other thing. If you are using a figure taken from another source, do remember to check for permission to use it. So if you, it's not uncommon to use something from a previous paper or something available on the web, whatever, just make sure you have permission. And the abstract can be either structured or unstructured. Now, an unstructured abstract like this is much more common in the social sciences than a structured abstract like this, but still worth knowing the difference between them, just in case your journal does ask for a structured abstract. So in a structured abstract, you normally see the same headings that reflect the headings in the main paper itself. So something like introduction, method, results, and discussion. We have slightly different ones here. We have background and then objective, design, results, and conclusion. You can also see a structured abstract that's got these headings, but they're actually embedded into one single paragraph. So without these spaces at the end of each section. But the headings are still highlighted. As I say, most people are more familiar with this style here.
Yeah, I mean, I've normally, yes, you're quite right. The one on the right is far more prevalent, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, right. Well, gosh, that's quite a lot of formatting points. And I think sometimes, especially early academics, don't appreciate quite how much goes on in the background there.
It's a lot to think about, isn't it? Yeah.
It is, yes. Now you mentioned the importance of consistency. Perhaps you could give us a few examples of what to look for when we talk about consistency.
Sure. Our editors are trained to check for consistency in every document, because it's the thing that I think is most difficult to do when you're writing a paper yourself. You really aren't thinking about you know, whether you've written the same word in exactly the same way all throughout the document, or whether you've spaced everything absolutely evenly. So we routinely, as I say, check for all kinds of things. Some of them occur in every single paper, so we just have a kind of almost checklist in our heads of what we need to do. Other things can be specific to a particular paper, so we kind of remain alert right from the beginning to look at things that might change from one instance to the next, so the use of different terms that mean the same thing and so on. So let's look at a few things that we check. Spelling is usually the journals might specify UK or US spelling and punctuation. Obviously, everybody is familiar with the most common differences between US and UK spelling, such as spelling of words such as organisation with an S or with a Z, and realise with an S and a Z. However, there are many more differences than that. Word will flag most of them, but it won't flag things like these Z endings. So you need to, if you're using UK English, it's okay to use Z endings, because that's kind of what we call Oxford English, but do make sure that you use it consistently. So don't mix up words with S endings and Z endings, because that's what journals don't like. It looks like a confusion of US and UK English. As I say, don't necessarily rely on the spell checker because it doesn't always pick up things like that. So yeah, be vigilant. The next point is to never use or try not to use different terms to mean the same thing. So if you begin referring to something in one way, don't start using a different term to describe it as you go along through the paper. I think it's a kind of temptation. A lot of people are taught at school not to, to use synonyms and to vary their language and stuff because it makes the writing more interesting. In scientific writing, we almost need to do the opposite. It's not that we want to make it uninteresting, but we need to make it as simple and clear as possible. And using different terms can be really confusing. So for instance, we might see in a single paper, an author using participants, subjects, respondents, students, and adolescents, all to refer to the same thing. These are all different terms that can be used for the people who took part in the study. And each time you come across it, you're wondering, is this a different group? Like, are we still referring to the participants that they recruited? Are the adolescents different from the students? It can be.
No, you're absolutely right. I think especially here in Asia, in Hong Kong and China, I mean, students are trained from a very young age to use as many synonyms as possible to showcase their grasp of vocabulary. So it works for creative writing, perhaps, but academic writing, we don't want to go down that avenue, right?
No, that's absolutely right. And the same goes for like not just these kind of terms, but where, this kind of technical terms and things that you use. Sometimes there's an option you can use one term or another. Like in the literature, you might find different terms used. Just choose one and stick to it rather than again switching backwards and forwards. So like it gets your message across much clearer because it saves the reader from having to constantly think.
Is this the same person?
Yeah, like just simple things that can obscure the meaning, but they could just be more concentrating on the meaning of the text. Abbreviations can be really frustrating. So often journals stipulate that you must abbreviate a term, but you then use it consistently. It has to be written in full at first use, both in the abstract and then again in the main text. And so then you write the term out in full, put the abbreviation in brackets, and then use it every time it appears thereafter. This kind of is the same as the problem with switching between terms. If you keep changing between using the full term and an abbreviation, it'll make the reader forget whether what the abbreviation means. If you use a full term, then it's like, well, I thought that was the abbreviation. I must have been wrong. So then they'll have to go back to check whether.
If you use a term only once in the abstract, do you not need to abbreviate it then?
No, just write it in full. Even twice, like if the term isn't too long, just use the full term. It's a lot less confusing. And then if it's used a lot in the document, then of course abbreviate it in the main text. But again, use a rule of thumb of like, if it's not used more than 3 or 4 times at least, then just consider using the full term, even if the abbreviation is common, because it's much easier to read text with full terms rather than abbreviation.
Otherwise you're hunting for, going through the notes and trying to find out what it stands for. Just going back a little bit there, you mentioned US, UK punctuation, and you highlighted the differences between spelling, the SZ, I know you've got color, harbor, those words. But I mean, there are other areas as well, right? I mean, you've got a lot of punctuation differences with speech marks, single, double quote marks. Again, different guidelines for different languages, in effect. As you said, I think you were hinting at it earlier, but
no, it's right. So for instance, with US English, I think as you said, a punctuation such as a comma would go inside a quotation rather than outside of it, whereas it's the opposite in UK English. And of course, US uses double punctuation marks, so double quote marks, and English uses UK English, which to me is English. Uses
to me too, I'm afraid.
Yes. Uses single quote
a little
marks.
biased, aren't we?
Yes. Yes, so do check for things like that, and also things like when you if you want to use like a dash to separate different parts of a sentence, a bit like the use of a colon or something, then in American English they use an M dash, which is much longer, whereas in UK English we use an N dash and put spaces around it. Right. So they're just all these little tiny details that we're just so familiar with them that we don't even think about it. But of course, if it's the first time you've had to switch the language that you're writing in, it can be really quite confusing.
Yes, must be. Okay.
Okay, so there's a few more things to check for inconsistency. Spacing between paragraphs and sections. So make sure that you don't suddenly start introducing double spacing between paragraphs or losing spacing that was there before and between different sections and so on. Also check the spacing between numbers and units and symbols. So here we have an example where this is so common, like almost every paper we have is presented such that, say, for instance, here we have the equal sign with spaces around it and around the P and the less than value sign. And yet here in the second example, they're closed up. And this I say, I can't emphasize how common this is. Again, we've got the same statistic here reported with a leading zero and without a leading zero. So again, we and the p-value has no leading zero here, but it does here. A leading zero is the one before the decimal point. So yeah, just make sure that you're consistent in little details like that. It's not, maybe it just seems trivial, but it just looks so much nicer, and it's so much easier to scan the page when,
right. Especially when it's a numbers heavy paper, right?
Yeah, absolutely. When you're reporting loads of results, it's far easier to read it when they're nicely spaced like this.
Okay.
Okay, so we can use italics and bold text for emphasis, but most journals don't like you to use bold text for emphasis. So generally stick to italics, but even then, only keep them to a minimum, because adding more emphasis than is strictly necessary means that it actually loses emphasis, because people start ignoring it if italics appears too often.
Right.
And also never use capitals for emphasis.
Okay.
Okay, so in results sections, we often see differences in the information that's included in the reporting. So a bit like the example I just gave you, where the results were presented slightly differently. Authors often include different information, say for the same type of test. So they might report another with all of the information in one case, but with some information missing in another case. For instance, a t-test might report the means and standard deviations, but forget to do it or deliberately miss it out for another group, another test, because maybe it's not significant, you don't see it as important. But I think it's really important that you include all of the information that you have, because then the reviewer or the reader can make their own mind up as to what is important, rather than just looking at the p-value. And the same goes for groups. So if you're going to include some information for one group, make sure you include it for the other group as well. Presentation of numbers can be a bit confusing, because there are many different styles, different ways of presenting numbers. The most common is to write numbers below 10 in words and those above 10 in numerals or symbols. This, I say, is the most common style, but then there's a confusion over what to do when you have sentences where both appear in the same sentence, because it often looks odd when you kind of get these different presentations and together. So one way to deal with it is to change all of the numbers, even the ones below 10, into numerals as well. I wouldn't advise changing them all into words for consistency, because then you can get really long phrases like 630. Will be, it's a lot to type out. So it's much more common to see everything changed to numbers rather than words.
Right.
Okay, consistently presenting quotations is another thing to check. If you, obviously not all papers include direct quotations, but if yours does, then it's important that you follow even if it's not the journal guidelines, follow the norms, the conventions in the field. So short quotes are usually included in the main text like this. So they're just written, and I've written this in US style English. So I should say it's just part of a normal sentence. Whereas longer quotes are usually separated into blocks like this. So they're indented. They don't use quotation marks because the offsetting of them already makes them stand out. And then the citation usually goes here at the end after the full stop. So sometimes we see it actually included as part of the quote, but obviously that's not correct.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, you've given us an awful lot to think about there in terms of, well, first of all, formatting and then consistency. I didn't realize there were that many items I had to check or put down on my little checklist.
I think we have a lot more as well.
Okay, we'll have to stop you there. I mean, what about the more general things that we have to consider? I mean, is there anything we have to think about in terms of writing style or verb tense? Any advice that you could give us in those areas?
I've got a couple of points that I think is worth considering. Of course, it's more about writing the paper itself rather than checks at the end. Although I think it's still something that you can check just before sending it for review. So consider the use of active and passive voice. I think we see a lot of papers written completely in passive voice, where there's no person actually doing the action. So the questionnaire was completed by the participants, rather than active voice, where the participants completed the questionnaire.
I think it's again, it's another Asian English school thing where they teach a lot of from primary level. Basically, using passive is a higher level of English, and therefore you should write in the passive voice. So I spend time in teaching in classes saying, actually, it's easier to understand the active voice.
It's much easier to understand. Yes, I agree. It's simpler. But also, I think it's really out of date advice. When I started studying psychology, I was taught the same. I was taught to write as if I wasn't part of anything that I was writing about. But that changed really not long after I started studying, and APA introduced the guidance that papers should be written in the first person and use the active voice as much as possible. And many other journals do as well. So even journals such as Nature, which is, Nature journals are the top in the world, and they advise writing in the active voice. Their instructions say to use "we performed the." So really, it's not uncommon. You will not be thought wrong for writing in the active voice and using the first person I and we. As Nick said, you use the active voice to create direct and concise sentences, especially when you're writing about the actual actions of people. It just makes more sense. You just try writing out words. I mean, you can see just from this question here, this one here, the sentence is longer when it's passive than when it's active, trivially so in this instance, but with longer sentence, it can make quite a difference how many words you actually add.
And of course, easier to make mistakes in. I mean, you have to think about putting things in the past tense. You've got to think what's the appropriate preposition, and so on. Yes, and there's a lot more room for confusion. I think it can be much more ambiguous, the writing, when it's when authors write about the study, it can often be ambiguous as to whether they're writing about the study they've conducted or somebody else's study. Whereas if they write our study, then of course we know which study they're talking about. So it's just can be much easier to include yourself in the writing. Okay.
Just before I move on, of course, if you decide not to use the first person, that's absolutely fine. But we do sometimes see papers that are written entirely in the passive voice with no mention of we until right at the end, in the discussion, and that can be a bit jarring. So, we would advise using it all the way through. But if you don't, then don't just suddenly introduce it at the end. So the last thing I want to mention in terms of consistency is verb tense, and I left it till last, although it is really probably the most difficult language issue that we encounter. You would think that verb tense should be quite simple. We all know how to use verb tense when we're speaking. We don't often get it wrong, but in writing, somehow it becomes very difficult. And this is not specific to any particular field, or it's also a problem for native English speakers. We see the same kind of problems in getting the tense right. So the temptation is to think that you have a tense, say like past tense, and you use that throughout the paper. But actually the tense needs to vary with the context of what you're talking about. So you'll use many different tenses in a paper. This example chart here is taken from the APA recommendations. I'm not going to go through it. I'm just using it as an example to show that in the literature review, you're using different tenses from, for instance, the discussion of the implications and presentation of the conclusions and so on. So do try and be aware of verb tense and make it as consistent as possible. So if you're talking about research that's been done in the past, make sure if it's described in the past tense on one occasion, make sure it is in another as well. So you could have, here it says Martin 2020 addressed. Don't have the next line saying Baron addresses, because obviously there's it just makes no sense to have one in one tense and one the other.
Okay, right. Well, we've identified the right target journal. I'm just going to think of these things. We've got the formatting right. It's now consistent. We've checked all our tenses and everything. I think we've got a little time. We can just touch on what we need to cover, what we need to include in the cover letter that we're going to send to the journal editor. Yes, just briefly, an outline of really what a cover letter needs to include. I think often writing a cover letter can be seen as another slightly trivial task, because it's just accompanying the paper after all. So really the paper is what's important. But it's very unlikely that editors are going to read a cover letter unless it invites them, unless they have a reason to do so. The cover letter kind of invites them to actually want to read it. They get so many submissions that they have no obligation to read every single paper at all. So although a good cover letter can't guarantee that the editor is going to send your paper for review, you can pretty much guarantee that a poor cover letter like this will end up with an early rejection. So it might seem sufficient just to write, please find our paper for consideration. We'd appreciate an early response, yours faithfully. It's done and dusted, they've got the paper, they can read it. But I think this shows little respect for the editor, because it's clearly rushed. The author hasn't done any research into the journal that they're actually going to submit to. It seems like maybe they're just throwing it out to one journal after another without really thinking too much about it. And it also assumes that the editor is going to read the paper to find out what it's about and why it might be suitable for this. Yeah, I think it's a good little example there. You've got, see, for many people writing English as a second language, the phrase "we would appreciate an early response at your convenience." I think to many, I say, writers of English as a second language would think that's actually a fairly polite phrase, but actually to native speakers, it's very direct and very pushy. Isn't it? It's like I'm expecting you to return this at what it would actually, your earliest convenience is my earliest convenience, which means immediate, right? So as you said, it is very pushy, and it's not as polite as I think the writer intended it to be. Absolutely. So probably some different expectations, isn't it? And yes, I think like reading this, like most native English speakers would think, well, why should I? I've got a busy job. I've got 30 papers to look at today. Yours will take its turn. Yes. So yeah, it's more likely to irritate an editor than to make them look kindly. So yeah, let's look at what you can do instead. The first thing I think is to look at to do some research. Now, most journal websites will include the editor's name on the website, so take a bit of time to try and find what it is, because a personally addressed email letter is of course much more personal and inviting. It shows that you've actually done that research. And then in your first paragraph, you can actually, sorry, before I say the first paragraph, once you've found the journal name, the journal editor's name,
check to see if the author guidelines include any requirements for the cover letter, so that you can collect all that information you need before you start. So yeah, while you're on the journal page, it's just worth checking that information too. They might actually have a kind of, even like a kind of example letter that you can copy.
Right.
So a general structure, like a typical structure, would be for the first paragraph to include the title of your manuscript and the type of manuscript it is, whether it's original research, review, or a case study or whatever, and a brief explanation of the background to the study, the question you sought to answer, and why. In the second paragraph, you want to concisely explain what was done in your study, report the main findings and why they're significant, as in like why they are of interest. But I do urge you not to copy the abstract. This is, again, a really common thing to do. But if the editor is interested and goes on to read the paper, then you've actually kind of lost an opportunity to use those extra words that you have to convince them further. So by only using the words in the abstract, you've duplicated your words, and I say by rewriting them in a different way or adding further information to the abstract, you can actually expand on what you want to say.
You've got a second shot, yes.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So finally, in your third paragraph, indicate why the readers of the journal will be interested in the work. So you can use the wording from the journal's aims and scope. Like if you just take those words and insert them into your letter, then you can then add an explanation of how your research fulfills these aims. And don't forget to emphasize the theoretical and practical contributions of the research the field, depending on what they are, of course, but they will obviously be looking to see what your contribution, what your paper actually contributes. In the final paragraph, include the name of the corresponding author and any specific journal-specific requirements, such as statements about adhering to ethical requirements. And also most journals want to see the following statements. A statement saying that the manuscript hasn't been submitted for publication or published elsewhere, and saying that all of the authors have approved the manuscript and agreed that it should be submitted to this journal. Okay, I think that, oh, sorry, no, finally signing off your cover letter. Sign off with yours sincerely if your letter is addressed to a named person. So if you found the name of the editor, if you couldn't find that name, then the polite way to sign off is yours faithfully. And
I remember that from school, yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Sure everybody knows it, but always worth a reminder. Yeah, so that's it. For you, hopefully you're ready to submit your paper for publication, and I hope that our tips will help you to achieve success with that.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Rachel. I mean, I think by going through all of those, elements there, going through, I mean, the detail there in the formatting and the consistency, and and realizing just how much detail is required. I quite understand. I mean, someone who's spent years writing a thesis or months writing a paper for publication, obviously they think that they've done most of the work, and they have, of course. I mean, doing the research and the reading and all of that, you sort of think, God, I've done my job, now the journal can take care of the rest of it, right? But yes, sometimes you just forget the journal's also sitting there with a whole pile of papers that are competing for space in their journal. So you're trying to get to the top of that pile, and you do have to take all these things into consideration. And I guess that's very much why we do end up with very unformatted documents ending up on our desks, where people are saying, can you just do this for me? Because I'm just tired of reading my own writing for the nth time.
We find it really, really hard to find mistakes in our own work. I look back on publications that my own publications written years ago, and well, that's before I'd done too much editing, so I forgive myself, but they are full of mistakes, the kind of things that I'm talking about. So I'm certainly not professing to be perfect, but I think that's the thing that we have an advantage as as editors, that's all we have to focus on. We know that you know the content, so we can take a different angle on it and check all those kind of things that you might miss.
Yeah, I mean, one of the exercises that I do in classes is, each member of each participant has to write a paragraph, and then we swap them all around, and everybody has to correct each other's writing.
Yes.
And initially they all think, well, this is a bit silly because we're all Chinese, so how can we spot mistakes in English? That's your job as the teacher. And in fact, they can all find mistakes in each other's writing, and that's what you said. When it's your own writing, it's very hard to identify those mistakes. But once you pick up something fresh, something somebody else has written, oh, that critical eye just manages to pull out so many things that the original person, the original writer missed.
Yeah.
Okay, I know we have run over time, but that being the case, so if any of you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We're not in a rush to leave you. Let's see, I have a question here from Akins. It says, for the same terms, I was taught that participant is for qualitative studies and respondents for quantitative studies. Is that true?
No, I wouldn't say so. Mainly, I would say a respondent is used when the participant has actually responded to something, such as a questionnaire or an interview or whatever. Participant is more of a generic term for anybody who participates in a study. So that could be somebody who is being interviewed, who fills in a survey. It doesn't really matter whether it's quantitative or qualitative, they are still a participant. So if you're doing interviews, for instance, you might call them participants, and then when you're actually describing the interviews, you could use interviewee, so that there isn't some flexibility in the terms there. But I wouldn't say there was a distinction between qualitative and quantitative research in the use of those terms.
Okay. Someone else has just asked, if a journal does not specify whether to use US or UK English, what should I pick? Which should I go for?
I would advise picking whichever is most familiar to you, because I think that way you'll make fewer mistakes. So obviously UK English is much more familiar to me, being British, and I have learned US English very well, but there are a lot of things that trip me up, and so I would always suggest doing it in the language, in the version that you're most used to. Okay.
Another one here. I've been asked to do mine in Australian English. Is that possible?
I think yes, I think I'm not quite sure. I wouldn't be able to tell you what the differences between UK, US, and Australian English are. But I know sometimes we get documents with Hong Kong spelling set and Hong Kong English spelling set, and the difference there seems to be that they use the Oxford spelling with IZ endings. So it might well be that it's the same for Australian English.
I know. I mean, I've been to Australia. That's my only claim to fame. I know they spell Labour as in the Labour Party without the U, for example, to differentiate it from the British Labour Party, which has a U.
Okay. So then maybe they're more closely.
I don't know if that's the only difference, but
yeah, no, that sounds much more like American English, doesn't it?
As well, yeah. But harbour is spelled with a U and colour is spelled with a U. It's only Labour, and only for the party. So if you talk about our labour is valued, then you use OUR. But if you talk about the Labour Party, that's OR.
Okay, so there's some real oddities with Australian English.
So I guess we're going to have to check the Aussie guide. Hold on, I've got some other questions coming through. Okay. If a journal rejects your paper without much information, is it possible for them to give you detailed comments to improve your work? Is it possible for them? Sorry, they've rephrased it later on. So, all right, so a journal has rejected our paper. They haven't explained why. Could they ask us for detailed comments on how to improve their work?
Yes, I mean, if the journal's just outright rejected it without reviewing it, then it's highly likely that maybe it was just the wrong journal that you submitted to, because Usually if the paper is a good fit, they will at least give it a review. So I think that's the first place to start, is making sure that this really is the most suitable place for the paper. We can offer lots of advice on how to improve the paper in many ways, but we don't do scientific reviews. So we won't be able to, we can give you advice on how to improve, for instance, the reporting of your methodology and results and things, and we can advise you where implications can be strengthened, all those kind of things. But obviously the actual design of the study itself, we don't have a service to review that side of things.
Right. Okay. There's questions. There are a few. Some of them are the same. Hold on. If you receive a desk rejection with some comments, is it possible to resubmit to the same journal? And secondly, would you recommend submitting it to the same journal?
I think unless the journal expresses keen interest and encourages you to resubmit, then unless you're really determined to be in that, to get your paper in that journal, then I would say look elsewhere. There are various reasons they may not be interested. I say that the fit is the main thing, that just may be outside their scope, even though you might perceive it as being within its scope, or maybe the impact factor. Maybe just look at whether it's really realistic. So it's really hard to be objective about your own research, and of course we all think it's our own research is the most important, but maybe you need to look at going down a little bit in your expectation. If they give very little information, then it can be worth getting back to the editors to say, can you give us anything further? Was it the design of the fundamental design of the study? Was it the lack of fit to the journal? Was it language problems with the writing of the paper? Just something broad, at least to get you started knowing where to improve it. Okay.
Well, I've got a number of people are very, very positive in that people are asking about AsiaEdit and our rates, and someone says, how long does it take to get a paper back? Okay, I guess this comes to me more than to you, Rachel. We will email you this PowerPoint in PDF format later, probably tomorrow. There will be a link to our website. In fact, the QR code that you see on the screen at the moment will take you to our homepage. We have a calculator on there where you enter the word count of your document, and that'll give you an approximate price and return time for that document. Obviously, the longer the document, the longer it'll take to edit, but there will be a few options: 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, or what have you. But the best way to look at that, rather than me just give you a price here, is to go to the calculator on the website, and you'll get an individual response to that. Now, when we look at papers, as Rachel said there, I mean, there's a lot that we're looking at. So it's not only looking for typos and punctuation. There's a lot more that goes on in the editing process. And what this means is we get some papers from professors in the UK and the US, and you can understand if they're an academic who's been working for a couple of decades, they've already got a long publication history. The papers that they send us are fairly polished, and we just need to do basically a proofread. Right, we're looking for the odd typo, and therefore the speed will be quicker, and the rate will be therefore will be lower. We do get papers that come from second, third language writers, and of course, there's going to be more for us to do, and in those instances, it's going to take a longer time to edit the same length of paper. So when you go to the calculator, you'll see the average number, but when we send you a quote, what you should do is email us your paper, and we'll give you an individualized quote, which will reflect both the length of your paper and the amount of work that we'll need to do. Okay, but if you've got any questions, we'll give you an email address to contact us directly tomorrow. Okay, all right. I think we've gone over the hour, which is it's good. I think there was an awful lot to say there. I mean, I think we could have gone into more detail, I'm sure, with the formatting and the consistencies and the cover letter. We could have gone into a bit more there, but I think we've managed to cover quite a lot of material in a nice short amount of time. So I think well done, Rachel. Thank you very much for your time. There in Italy. I know she has Hong Kong in the background. Rachel was with us a couple of years ago, just before COVID hit before the protests hit Hong Kong and COVID. Otherwise, she should be visiting us more frequently. Okay. Oh, I have one more question. So I just try to squeeze this one in.
Yep.
Could you tell me any reasons for a longer time being spent on a desk rejection, say 45 days, than what is written on some websites? Now, they appreciate there's a pandemic going on, so that may be one reason. But is there any other reason why things take longer?
Just the volume of work, I think. I think that what they publish on the websites are probably what they aim to do in normal times. But I don't suppose they can give a guarantee that that's the turnaround time that they can actually stick to. So that's why it's kind of worth looking to see what they say, because 45 days initially is, I suppose, maybe around average, but yeah, longer than that, and it starts to get quite frustrating, doesn't it? I honestly think it's just the volume of submissions that they get. And as I say, if you do what you can to make an impact with your cover letter and make the journal editor really excited to receive your paper, then hopefully you can attract attention and get yours reviewed above some of these, at least.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
They are very busy.
Okay. I'd like to thank everybody for attending this evening. Thanks for giving up your evening, your Wednesday evening. And Rachel, thank you again for your time. And we shall speak more very shortly, I know.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye. And to the rest of you, thank you as well. And a good night. Have a pleasant evening.